what else can they do to try to spur business in this country? Because that's really, I think, part of what this election was about. We're joined by Carl Schram right now. He's a professor. He's an author, an entrepreneur. You're a professor at Syracuse University. Is that correct, Dr. Schram?
Yes, Mark.
Welcome into the program.
Oh, my pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. So your last book, tell me if I'm wrong, was one called Better Capitalism?
That's right. I wrote it with Bob Lighton when we both worked at the Kauffman Foundation over in Kansas City.
Very good. And in your mind, what is the number one thing that Donald Trump could get in there and affect that would help small business in this country? And then maybe you can expand on what some of the biggest barriers are right now for small business people.
Well, I think there are three things that he should do right away. First, he's committed to getting the economy growing again. So critical. To hear a president say we should be growing at least 4% a year. When you get 4%, you get proportionally more businesses starting. So, if you had 100 companies start at 2%, you get 120. You'll get 220 companies start at 4%. So you get a proportionate kick up. Second, in order to get there, he's got to cut taxes. And that actually has a real implication because we have about 80%, at least 85% of all small businesses are incorporated under Subchapter S, which means they're treated as if they were just private income. They can't benefit from the protection of larger corporations in terms of taxes. The third thing, of course, is you've got to relieve all this regulatory overburden that is geared largely under crony capitalism to hurt startups and small companies much more than it is the big companies that can afford dealing with it to begin with, but also have the leverage in Washington to make those regulations work more for people who are the competitors and not, for themselves. This is the very definition of what crony capitalism is. Those are three good starts.
You would think Donald Trump would just understand that better than most people based on his business background. But even if he isn't in the pocket of some of these big businesses who've been happy to see these regulations stay in place because it doesn't give them as much competition, he's still got to get something through Congress. Realistically, what do you think he's going to be able to do in this first term?
Well, I think given that the House and the Senate are both in the hands of Republicans, all three groups, the House, the Senate, and the President, had better get a tax cut in place. Otherwise, as Ted Cruz said yesterday, there'll be pitchforks going to Washington.
Yeah.
That's the critical issue, and I suspect he can get that through. Now, the next issue is what you were talking about is the run into my interview, and that is, what can he get done on that budget? And we haven't heard much yet, but what I'd be hopeful for is to see an approach to attrition that would cut the federal workforce by at least 30 or 40%, and some radical steps to basically shut a few of the agencies entirely. My favorite position is one I've written about before is basically move 80%, 90% of the federal workforce out into the rest of the country. I mean, you tell me whether or not St. Louis wouldn't be better off with 10,000 or 15,000 jobs from the Department of Agriculture if it was headquartered there. You could keep the secretary and a few deputies in Washington close to the seat of government, but most of the Agriculture Department there's no reason on earth they should be in Washington driving up real estate prices and letting people who work for the government easily forget what the rest of Americans look like.
Well, those are revolution. I mean, that would be a revolutionary idea. Donald Trump may be thinking along those lines, but, I've heard other people talk about when it comes to eliminating government agencies, the Department of Education and a few others are usually right at the top of the list. Maybe the IRS, if you could get some good tax reform in place.
Yeah, we should have tax reform. I mean, for heaven's sakes, we live, all of us have computers. We live in an age of the Internet. There's really no reason, again, to have all of our resources concentrated physically in Washington. All of the government's business should be done on the Internet. Second, you're absolutely right. If we did tax reform, we did real tax reform. So we had percentages of our income that were due to the state and percentages that were federally taxed, with a minimum amount of qualifications, exemptions, etc. It should all be filed electronically, and it should all have artificial intelligence that runs over it, and you should be able to run the IRS with maybe 1,000 people and perhaps another 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 who are inspectors of tax returns, but nowhere near the tens and tens of thousands of people who work for the IRS now, all of whom have enormous personal discretion that could work and often does work, as we have discovered, against regular citizens. The people who work for these agencies should be reminded that they are citizens like everybody else.
That's a great point. We're talking with Professor Carl Schram, who's written books about our economic system and how we could get it better. I'm trying to think of some of the barriers that are in place now when it comes to these companies, these startup companies. What would you say is number one?
Well, the biggest barriers are often hidden. The real biggest barriers are local regulation. So to start a business, you have to deal with the state over workers' comp and whatnot. You have to get, building codes that qualify. I remember the last business I started, before I paid the landlord, before I took possession of the suite of offices, I had to pay the landlord almost $40,000 to recondition an internal bathroom to qualify for the disability requirement.
Right.
And I owned that suite of offices for 8 years, and that bathroom was never once used. Right. So how come we couldn't sort of change those rules to make a bathroom for disabled on every floor that other tenants could use? Right. So there's a perfect example of the type of overhead costs, the workers' compensation costs, now the Obamacare costs. Not to mention the regulations that impinge from health departments and other building code departments. These are all real onerous decisions. And the other, of course, is crony capitalism at the local level. So your listeners know I teach in Syracuse. There is no Uber in upstate New York. The taxi cartels are protected by the state government in Albany. And if you'd like a more efficient way with cleaner cars and friendlier people who are responsible and you could rate just like Uber,
right?
Forget it.
Yep.
Okay. Not in upstate.
We've had the same problem here in St. Louis. They've been fighting them tooth and nail because they frankly don't want the competition. Professor Carl Schram, thank you for your time. I'll direct people to your website, Carl Schram, SCHRAMM.com. People can find out more about your books and some of your writings. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
weekend. I appreciate that.